Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a really fascinating historical and textual mystery from the earliest days of the Christian faith. Seriously, whether you're a massive theology buff or just someone who loves a good puzzle about how ancient history was recorded and translated, this is going to be an absolute eye-opener. We're looking at a comprehensive document all about something called Agency Christology. We'll unpack its claims right here as we go. Because listen to this. If this document is correct, the way millions of people read their core text has been filtered through the wrong historical lens for over 16 centuries. Crazy, right? Let's get into it. So, the central question we're pulling from our source material is basically this. What if the absolute core of Christian theology was built on a lost translation? Did the famous Council of Nicaea back in the 4th century actually recover the original beliefs of the very first Christians? Or did they invent an entirely new framework that totally replaced an older Jewish one? The source makes a really compelling, highly detailed case that a massive theological shift happened right under history's nose. And the wild part? It's all hiding in plain sight in the ancient texts. Here's the roadmap for how we're going to solve this mystery together. First, the theological mystery. Second, the Jewish agency model. Then, Philo and the Logos. Fourth, the grammatical battlefield. And finally, how Jewish became Greek. All right, Section 1, the theological mystery, the 4th century creed versus the 1st century matrix. To kick things off, we really need to define the two competing historical frameworks our source presents, just to set the stage and understand the huge gap between these two very different centuries. Okay, so on one side we have the Nicene Model. This represents the 4th century view claiming the Son is homoousios. That's a Greek term meaning essentially made of the exact same substance, fully co-equal and co-eternal with the Father. But in stark contrast, we have the agency model from the 1st century. This framework argues that the Son is ontologically derived, entirely subordinate, and completely dependent on the Father. Just think about the sheer gravity of this claim for a second. The source is arguing that the Nicene co-equal model didn't actually recover apostolic Christianity at all. Instead, it replaced this much older Jewish subordinationist framework with something brand new. Moving on to Section 2, the Jewish agency model, the Shaliach Principle. To truly wrap our heads around this 1st century mindset, we've got to look at the Jewish soil the New Testament actually grew out of, specifically a legal and cultural concept known as Shaliach. So what exactly is a Shaliach? Well, it translates to divine agency. It's a legal and theological setup where a supreme principle rules through a uniquely exalted dependent agent who perfectly represents them. Think of it kind of like a royal ambassador in the ancient world. An ambassador carries the king's name and wields his absolute full authority, but, and this is key, without actually being the king. The ambassador is a completely perfect representative. Literally, when he speaks, the king speaks. But that authority is entirely delegated. It's not inherent to the ambassador himself. To really drive that concept home, consider this quote from the ancient rabbinic text 3 Enoch. It describes a supreme divine agent named Metatron like this. He called me the lesser Yahweh. My name is in him. It's super fascinating to find this in rabbinic literature, right? It shows us exactly how pre-Christian Jewish texts described these supreme divine agents. They carried God's sacred name by appointment, not by having a co-equal nature. The source points out a pretty crucial logical rule here. You literally can't have a lesser co-equal. It's an oxymoron. The name and the authority are a deliberate grant from the supreme principle, a strict delegation of power, rather than a shared eternal nature. Which brings us to Section 3, Philo and the Logos, the pre-Christian witness. Now let's look at what the source literally calls the strategic nuclear option in this debate, a historical figure who's basically impossible to ignore in this puzzle, Philo of Alexandria. Now, Philo was a non-Christian, completely mainstream Jewish philosopher, but remarkably, he explicitly wrote about the Logos, the Word, as a second God, or deutros theos, well before the New Testament was even written. The source argues that Philo absolutely proves that a fully developed subordinationist theology of a divine agent was already the intellectual air the apostles were breathing. This wasn't some fringe, underground cult belief. It was just mainstream Hellenistic Judaism. And honestly, this completely reframes how we might read the foundational texts of the Christian faith. What makes Philo such an explosive piece of this puzzle is how his exact vocabulary perfectly lines up with the New Testament authors.
Philo calls the Logos God's firstborn, the beginning and the image of God. And you're going to find those exact same phrases popping up decades later in New Testament books like Colossians and Revelation. Firstborn of all creation, the arche of God's creation and image of the invisible God. The source contends this proves the apostles were actively tapping into an existing, robust Jewish framework. They didn't just pull these theological terms out of thin air. They applied Philo's well-established concept of a derived subordinate logos straight onto Jesus.
Let's turn to Section 4, the Grammatical Battlefield, decoding the Greek text. Because the really crucial point here is how this Jewish background radically shifts the way we translate and understand the super dense Greek grammar of the New Testament. All right, this brings us to the incredibly famous opening of John 1:1. The Nicene view leans heavily on specific Greek grammar rules, like Colwell's rule. Theologians often use this to argue that definite nouns preceding a verb lack an article, which implies that the phrase, "the Word was God," points to an absolute, definite co-equality. But the agency view pushes back hard on this. They point out that John actually intentionally distinguished between the supreme God by using the Greek hotheos with the definite article and the divine Word, using just theos without the article. Basically, the source argues John is using the exact same grammatical distinctions Philo established. The point? To show the Word is divine in nature, for sure, but is strictly not the Supreme Father. But hey, this explainer wouldn't be complete without looking at the counter-arguments, right? Modern theologians like Richard Bauckham present a really sophisticated challenge called the divine identity thesis. Bauckham argues that the New Testament actually includes Jesus entirely inside God's unique identity. He points out that Jesus is assigned sole creator functions. He shares cosmic lordship, and that strict Old Testament texts about YHW are applied directly to Jesus. So for Bauckham, this clearly means Jesus crosses the boundary from being a mere agent to being fully included in the unique divine identity. How does the agency model respond? Well, by calling out what it sees as a fundamental false binary. Bauckham assumes that sharing a divine identity strictly requires ontological co-equality, meaning they literally have to be made of the exact same eternal substance. But the agency response goes right back to our ambassador analogy. It argues that an agent can perfectly exercise the king's sovereignty, bear his name, and receive his titles representationally without ever actually becoming the king himself. In other words, it's functional identity. It's pure representation, not a shared substance. Along similar lines, we have apologist J.P. Holding, who presents what's known as the collapse theory. He suggests that if Jesus is the perfect, absolutely unlimited agent of God, the agency relationship simply collapses into complete identity. He argues that things like the servant language, ancient patron-client honor models, and the direct application of YWH texts mean the operational boundary between the sender and the agent functionally disappears. They just merge. However, according to the agency framework, perfect legal representation in ancient honor cultures actively maintained hierarchical dependence. It never ever erased the distinction between sender and agent. In fact, the source makes a really profound point right here. Perfect representation is the goal of agency, not the elimination of it. Think about it. If complete representation somehow erased the difference between two parties, then no ambassador, no emissary or legal proxy in all of ancient history could ever exist without suddenly, poof, becoming the exact person who sent them. It just doesn't work that way. To prove this hierarchy is maintained permanently, the source points to explicit texts like 1 Corinthians 15. The text says, "The Son himself will be made subject to him who put everything under him, so that God may be all in all." The source asks a really simple but totally piercing question. If the agency supposedly collapses into co-equal identity, well, who exactly is being subjected to whom? Texts like this, the source argues, blatantly refuse to collapse. The Son remains permanently subject to the Father. That brings us to Section 5, how Jewish became Greek, the historical rupture. Because if the apostles operated strictly inside this Jewish agency framework, we're left staring at a massive historical question. How on earth did the church ultimately arrive at the complex Greek metaphysics of the Nicene Council? Let's take a look at the timeline. This timeline maps out a totally fascinating and arguably tragic historical rupture. From 30 to 70 AD, the Jerusalem church operated comfortably and fluently in that Jewish agency framework. But by the 2nd century, a massive cultural and theological shift happens. Judaism formally condemns the two powers in heaven theology. This effectively severed the very vocabulary the apostles had naturally relied on to explain Jesus. Fast forward to 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, and you have Gentile theologians who are completely disconnected from that original Jewish context. Stripped of the ancient legal framework of agency, they were forced to answer Jewish theological questions using Greek Platonic philosophy. And as a result, they had to invent entirely non-scriptural terms, like homousios, just to make it all fit together.
As we wrap up this explainer, the source leaves us with a seriously provocative challenge. Do you read the New Testament through the first-century Jewish lens the apostles actually had, or through a 4th-century Greek metaphysical lens they never used and, frankly, never needed? At the end of the day, it fundamentally becomes a question of historical lenses and the massive, centuries-long ripples of translation. And that brings us to our final slide and really our final question for you. Where do your historical assumptions come from? Seeing all of this laid out visually really makes you stop and wonder about the origins of what we just casually accept as absolute historical fact. What other first-century truths might be hiding in plain sight behind 4th-century translations? Keep questioning, keep looking deeply at the sources, and we'll see you in the next explainer.